Pelican Bay Prison, the brutal truth behind the walls. The scream in the SHU. The sound was unlike anything you've ever heard. A deep, desperate scream, echoing off cold concrete walls. It came from inside the SHU, Pelican Bay's notorious security housing unit, where inmates spend 23 hours a day in total isolation. Guards rushed toward the steel doors. Inside, they found a man with blood running down his arms, fists pounding the wall as he shouted, "I can't take it anymore." Inmates in nearby cells began to bang on their doors, chanting, screaming, laughing. The hallway turned into a war zone of noise. The officers froze. They had seen this before. This wasn't just an outburst, it was the beginning of something bigger. And in that moment, one terrifying question filled the air. How much longer can Pelican Bay keep its darkest secrets locked away? The birth of a monster. To understand why that scream matters, we have to go back. In 1989, California built Pelican Bay State Prison, right near the Oregon border. It was designed as a place for the worst of the worst. Killers, gang leaders, and inmates who controlled crime networks even from inside other prisons were shipped here. But Pelican Bay was different. This wasn't just a prison. It was a fortress, thick concrete walls, miles of razor wire, and armed guards patrolling 24/7. Inside, the prison was split in two. A general population yard where men lived in cell blocks, worked, and sometimes played basketball under watchful eyes. And the SHU, the security housing unit, a place designed to break the human mind. In the SHU, cells are 8 by 10 feet, no windows, just a concrete bed and a steel toilet. Prisoners eat alone, exercise alone, and spend decades without touching another human being. At first, the prison sold it as necessary for safety. They said it would stop gang wars, stop riots, keep the state's most dangerous criminals locked down. But what really happened behind those walls was far more brutal. And soon, Pelican Bay would become a global symbol of prison cruelty. The blood in the yard. It didn't take long before Pelican Bay showed its true face. One morning in the main yard, two rival gang members locked eyes. It started with a shout, then fists, then blades. The fight spread like fire. Dozens of inmates joined in. Shanks cut through flesh. Boots slammed into faces. Guards scrambled for control, but the violence was too fast, too bloody. From the tower above, a correctional officer screamed into his radio. Lethal force authorized. Gunshots cracked the sky. The yard fell silent. Bodies lay bleeding on the concrete. In the official report, the prison called it a necessary action to maintain order. But inmates who survived told a different story, one of constant tension where violence wasn't the exception, it was the rule. And for those who lived through it, there was no guarantee they'd survive the next day. The message was clear. At Pelican Bay, life could end in seconds. Life inside the box. After the blood in the yard, many of those inmates were dragged straight into the SHU. This is where the real punishment began. Imagine this. You wake up in total silence. A fluorescent light buzzes overhead. No clock. No sunlight. No voices. Just you, for concrete walls, and your thoughts. The only time you leave your cell is for yard time. But don't think of a yard with grass or fresh air. At Pelican Bay, yard means a small concrete cage just a little bigger than your cell with nothing but sky above. Prisoners call it a dog run, because it feels like you're an animal in a kennel. Meals are slid through a slot in the door. No human contact. Some men go years without touching another hand. At first, some prisoners tried to stay strong. They'd exercise in their cells. Read whatever scraps of books they were given. Even shout conversations through air vents. But slowly, the silence began to crush them. Some started hallucinating. Others stopped eating. One man was found rocking back and forth, whispering to people who weren't there. Pelican Bay didn't just lock away bodies. It broke minds. And for those who couldn't take it anymore, the outcome was far worse. The protest of hunger. By the early 2000s, word of Pelican Bay's SHU had spread. Families, lawyers, and activists began asking questions. How long can you keep a man in total isolation? The prison said, as long as we want. It's for safety. But the men inside had had enough. So in 2011, thousands of prisoners across California, led by Pelican Bay inmates, launched a hunger strike. They refused food. Day after day, week after week, their bodies grew weaker. Some collapsed in their cells. Medical staff begged them to eat. But the prisoners had one message. We will starve until the world knows the truth about Pelican Bay. The hunger strike shook the system. Newspapers reported it. Families protested outside the gates. Even international human rights groups took notice. And yet, inside those walls, guards whispered something chilling. If they want to die, let them. The prison would rather let men waste away than admit the SHU was torture. But the strike was only the beginning. Soon, Pelican Bay would face its darkest scandal yet. Secrets that leaked out. The hunger strike forced people outside the prison to finally start listening. Families spoke out, lawyers filed lawsuits, and reporters demanded access. What they found shocked the world. Pelican Bay's SHU wasn't just punishment, it was a machine of control. Men weren't sent there for breaking prison rules. Many were locked in indefinitely, simply for being accused of belonging to gangs. Here's how it worked. If guards believed you were a gang member even without solid proof, you could be thrown into the SHU for life. Evidence? It could be something as small as a drawing, a tattoo, or even a letter written in Spanish. One inmate spent over 20 years in solitary, not for murder, not for assault, but for an old photo where he was seen standing near a suspected gang member. Prison officials called it validation. But inside the cells, inmates had another name for it. Buried alive. The courts tried to demand answers. Human rights groups called it torture. But the California Department of Corrections dug in its heels. And then, just when the lawsuits gained ground, the prison was rocked by another explosion of violence. The riot nobody saw coming. It started with whispers in the chow hall. Two rival groups, both furious about gang validations, decided they wouldn't take it anymore. On a summer afternoon, the yard filled with inmates. Guards stood ready on the towers, eyes sharp. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then chaos. Dozens of men rushed each other with sharpened metal rods, fists, and makeshift shields. Blood splattered across the concrete. The air filled with screams. Guards fired rubber bullets. They sprayed tear gas. But the fighting didn't stop. From the tower, a rifle cracked. One man dropped. Then another. The riot finally ended when the yard was littered with bodies. Some dead, many more badly injured. The official report claimed necessary force. But survivors swore guards waited too long, as if they wanted the fight to burn hot before stepping in. And in the aftermath, dozens of men were dragged back into the SHU. Pelican Bay had sent its message loud and clear. Resistance would be crushed. Yet even with fear at its peak, a new kind of resistance was building, one that didn't involve fists or blades. The lawsuit that shook Pelican Bay. In 2012, a group of prisoners finally had their chance to speak in court. They argued that decades of solitary confinement was cruel and unusual punishment, violating the Constitution. The world began to hear their voices. Men describing hallucinations, paranoia, even madness. One testified he hadn't touched his mother's hand in over 30 years. Another said he didn't know what his own adult children looked like anymore. The lawsuit grew bigger, eventually involving thousands of inmates across California. Lawyers presented evidence that the SHU didn't just hold violent men. It was being used to silence voices, control gangs, and punish those who dared to question authority. For the first time, it looked like Pelican Bay might lose. The state faced global shame. The word torture was now being used by judges, reporters, and human rights leaders. And just when it seemed like change might finally come, Pelican Bay's walls echoed once again with blood. The cell block execution. One night, guards patrolling a tier noticed something unusual. A prisoner lay motionless on the floor of his SHU cell. At first they thought he had fainted. But when they unlocked the door, the truth was worse. He had been strangled with a strip of cloth, his lifeless eyes staring upward. The impossible question was this: how could a man be murdered in total isolation? The prison's official answer was silence. But whispers spread quickly. Some believed guards had looked the other way. Others claimed inmates had somehow communicated and planned the killing with secret signals, even through walls. Whatever the truth, the message was the same. Even in a place built for control, death could still slip through the cracks. The news spread outside, fueling the lawsuits and protests. But Pelican Bay wasn't done shocking the world yet. The breaking point. By 2015, the pressure became unbearable. Judges ruled against California. The hunger strikes, the lawsuits, and the mounting evidence of psychological torture forced the system to admit what it had denied for decades. The SHU could no longer be used for indefinite solitary confinement. Thousands of men were slowly released back into general population or transferred out of Pelican Bay's isolation units. For some, it was the first time in decades they saw another person face to face. But the victory came too late for many. Some had already lost their sanity. Others had taken their own lives. And families would never recover the years stolen by the cold walls of Pelican Bay. Even today, though the rules have changed, the shadow of the SHU still haunts California's prison system. Because Pelican Bay didn't just reveal brutality. It revealed a truth the state tried to hide. Once you step behind those walls, justice is no longer guaranteed. The Watchtower silence. Even after the courts forced reforms, Pelican Bay was far from safe. The SHU no longer held thousands indefinitely, but the culture inside the prison hadn't changed. One cold morning, a correctional officer stood in the watchtower overlooking the main yard. He spotted two inmates pacing in circles, their eyes locked. Tension was thick in the air. The officer's finger hovered over the rifle trigger. He had the power to end lives in seconds, but he hesitated. Suddenly one man lunged. A shank glistened in the sun. The second collapsed, blood pouring from his chest. Alarms screamed. Sirens echoed. Guards stormed in, dragging bodies across the yard. The officer in the tower didn't fire. Some said he froze. Others whispered he wanted to see the violence play out. Either way, the silence in that tower cost a man his life. And inside Pelican Bay, whispers began to spread. Were the guards protecting inmates, or were they letting the blood spill for control? The prisoner who vanished. Pelican Bay had always been a fortress. No one escapes. At least that's what the state claimed. But one day, a name disappeared from the roll call. An inmate, serving a life sentence, had vanished from his cell without explanation. The prison announced he had been transferred. But families searched. Lawyers demanded records. No paperwork existed. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he was killed during a secret fight and buried in unmarked ground. Others claimed the guards made him disappear for cooperating with investigators. A few even whispered he had pulled off the impossible, escaped the Supermax. To this day, the truth of his disappearance has never been confirmed. And in Pelican Bay, that mystery became a warning. If they want you gone, you'll be gone. The War of the Gangs. Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was a battlefield for America's most feared gangs. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family, and others. Behind the walls, these groups didn't just fight each other, they controlled networks on the outside. Drugs, extortion, and even hits ordered from solitary confinement. In 2016, intelligence leaked of a brewing war. Rival gangs had marked a date. Guards prepared, but they didn't know when the spark would hit. It happened in the chow hall. A tray clattered to the floor and instantly chaos erupted. Inmates stabbed each other with sharpened utensils. Chairs flew across the room. Guards sprayed pepper gas that choked everyone in sight. The floor was slick with blood and food. And as the riot raged, one inmate screamed a warning that chilled everyone who heard it. This isn't the end, this is only the beginning. That night, Pelican Bay was locked down. But the gangs had made their point. The prison didn't control them. They controlled the prison. The whistleblower. Among the guards, not everyone agreed with how Pelican Bay was run. One officer, who had worked there for years, secretly reached out to reporters. He described scenes of brutality. Guards beating inmates during cell extractions. Officers covering up injuries in official reports. Orders from higher-ups to look the other way when violence broke out. He risked his career, even his life, to reveal what was happening. When his identity leaked, fellow guards turned against him. His car was vandalized. His family received threats. Inside Pelican Bay, inmates whispered that even the staff couldn't trust each other anymore. And just as his story began hitting national headlines, something happened that silenced him forever. One morning, his body was found in his home. The cause? Suicide. But those who knew him swore he wasn't suicidal. The question remains unanswered. Did the truth cost him his life? The night of fire. The year was 2018. Pelican Bay had been under pressure for decades. Lawsuits, protests, hunger strikes, exposés. But that night, something happened that made headlines around the world. Inmates in one block set fire to their mattresses. Flames roared up the cell doors, smoke filled the tier. Sirens blared as guards scrambled to put it out. The prison went into chaos. Some inmates used the smoke as cover to attack rivals. Others pounded on doors, begging to be let out before they burned alive. By dawn, the flames were out, but the scars remained. Several men were hospitalized, one didn't survive, and the smell of burnt plastic lingered in the air for weeks. The fire was officially labeled an isolated incident. But those inside knew it was more than that. It was a message. Pelican Bay was reaching a breaking point. And the world was about to see just how brutal the truth behind those walls could get. The officers' revenge. Pelican Bay wasn't just brutal for inmates, it was brutal for the staff too. Correctional officers worked long hours, trapped inside the same gray walls, surrounded by constant danger. One officer, after years of threats from gangs, finally snapped. Late one night, during a routine cell search, he cornered a prisoner who had once spit in his face. There were no cameras in that corner. No witnesses. Minutes later, the inmate was dragged out, bruised and bleeding, claiming he had been beaten with a baton. The official report said, "Resisted orders. Necessary force used." But inside the block, whispers spread. The officer had gotten his revenge, and the system would cover it up. For prisoners, the message was clear. In Pelican Bay, retaliation never stopped. And it wasn't just the guards who held grudges. Because one night soon after, that same officer found himself on the other side of payback. The hit list. Hidden deep in Pelican Bay's gang culture was something terrifying. A list. Names written on scraps of paper, smuggled through hidden channels, passed cell to cell. It wasn't a commissary list. It was a hit list. Inmates marked for death, some for betrayal, others for debt, a few simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. One officer's name appeared on it. The same man accused of beating a prisoner. Within days, while patrolling a tier, he was ambushed. An inmate lunged through the bars with a sharpened piece of metal, slashing his neck. Blood poured as alarms rang. The officer barely survived. The hit list was real. And now, guards realized, the war inside Pelican Bay wasn't just inmate versus inmate, it was inmate versus staff. The breakdown. Isolation wasn't just destroying inmates, it was eating away at everyone. A prisoner who had spent more than 25 years in solitary began showing signs of a complete mental collapse. He smeared the walls with words written in his own blood. He shouted at invisible voices. He claimed spiders were crawling under his skin. Medical staff begged the prison to transfer him to a hospital. Instead, he was left in the SHU, his cries echoing through the concrete hallways. One night, guards found him collapsed, his body lifeless on the floor. The prison labeled it self-inflicted. But others knew, Pelican Bay had driven him to madness, and then to death. And his story was not the last. The lawsuit settlement. By 2015, years of legal battles finally forced the state to settle. California agreed to end indefinite solitary confinement. For the first time in decades, some men walked out of the SHU. They blinked into the sunlight. Some cried. Others stood frozen, overwhelmed after years of darkness. Families celebrated. Lawyers declared victory. Reporters called it historic. But even with the settlement, the damage was done. Many men couldn't adjust. They were too broken, too scarred by years in the box. One former SHU prisoner told a reporter, "When I close my eyes, I still see the walls. I don't know how to live without them." The settlement brought change, but it couldn't erase decades of suffering. And just when the world thought Pelican Bay had finally been tamed, another storm was brewing. The hidden files. Years later, investigative journalists obtained secret files from inside Pelican Bay. They revealed shocking details. Guards staging gladiator fights by placing rivals in the same yard. Beatings covered up as accidents. Medical neglect that left men untreated until it was too late. The files proved what inmates had been saying all along. Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was a machine of suffering, designed to break men physically, mentally, and spiritually. And as the documents were released to the public, one chilling question remained. If these are the secrets we know, what else is still hidden behind Pelican Bay's walls? The sound of madness. At night, Pelican Bay was never quiet. In the SHU, inmates screamed through the vents. Some sang to themselves. Others shouted threats that carried down the concrete corridors. But one sound disturbed everyone, the endless banging. A prisoner, locked up for over 2 decades, began pounding his fists against the steel door every night. Hours at a time. Guards tried to ignore it. Inmates begged him to stop. But he wouldn't. Bang, bang, bang. Finally, after weeks, the noise stopped. Guards entered his cell, and found him slumped in the corner. His hands were swollen, broken from the pounding. His mind, completely gone. Whispers spread across the tier. The walls don't just confine you, they drive you insane. And madness wasn't the only danger that grew in those shadows. The smuggling empire. Even in a fortress like Pelican Bay, contraband found its way inside. Cell phones, drugs, even tiny weapons were smuggled through corrupt staff, visiting rooms, or hidden in deliveries. From inside solitary cells, gang leaders ran empires on the outside. They ordered hits. They moved drugs across states. And they did it all with nothing more than a cell phone, smuggled past guards who looked the other way for cash. One intercepted call revealed an inmate ordering an assassination hundreds of miles away. The FBI got involved, but the prison kept denying how deep it went. For the public, the question was chilling. If gang leaders can run empires from inside Pelican Bay, who really controls the prison, the guards or the gangs? The answer came violently, when the gangs decided to remind everyone of their power. The yard ambush. It was a crisp morning. The yard was filled with inmates exercising, playing basketball, walking laps. Guards watched from towers, alert but calm. Then it happened. A group of inmates suddenly circled one man. Shanks flashed in the sunlight. The ambush was brutal and fast. The victim stabbed over 30 times before guards could fire warning shots. The man collapsed, covered in blood. The yard froze. Within minutes, alarms roared and the prison went into full lockdown. The message was undeniable. Even under total control, violence could erupt in seconds. And this attack wasn't random. Investigators discovered it had been ordered from inside the SHU. Pelican Bay's most feared unit, the one meant to crush gangs, had instead become their command center. The medical neglect. For years, inmates complained not just about isolation, but about medical neglect. Doctors rarely visited. Requests for help were ignored. One diabetic inmate begged for insulin. Guards dismissed him as faking it. By the time a nurse checked, he was unconscious. He never woke up. Another man reported chest pains. His cries were brushed aside until he collapsed in his cell. When medical staff finally arrived, it was too late. Inside Pelican Bay, sickness wasn't treated. It was punished with silence. And when families demanded answers, the prison buried the truth under paperwork. But then one case became too big to ignore, because the victim's death sparked an uproar far beyond the walls. The death that made headlines. It was supposed to be a routine day. But when guards opened a cell door in the SHU, they found an inmate lifeless on the floor. At first they called it suicide. Another broken man. Another tragedy in isolation. But when outside investigators reviewed the body, they saw bruises, deep ones, across his ribs and back. Signs of a beating. The story hit the news. Families protested. Activists demanded justice. For the first time the world asked, was Pelican Bay covering up murder inside its walls? The scandal grew so large, lawmakers were forced to visit the prison themselves. And what they saw in those cells left even the politicians shaken. The politicians step inside. For years, lawmakers had only heard stories about Pelican Bay. Reports, lawsuits, and testimony from families. But after the scandal of the mysterious death, they were forced to walk inside. What they saw stunned them. Rows of windowless cells. Men pacing in tiny spaces like caged animals. Prisoners with blank stares, whispering to themselves. Others pressing their faces against the slots, desperate to speak a single word to someone outside. One lawmaker later admitted, it felt less like a prison, and more like a human laboratory of suffering. But even after their visit, little changed. The walls were too thick, the system too powerful, and the truth too ugly. And then, the unthinkable happened. The guard who snapped. One correctional officer had seen enough. Years of violence, screams, and cover-ups had eaten away at him. One night, while transporting inmates, he turned his baton not on prisoners, but on his fellow officers. He claimed he couldn't take it anymore. That the prison was destroying not just inmates but everyone who worked there. When news broke, Pelican Bay officials tried to bury the incident. But the story leaked. Even the staff were cracking under the pressure of the Supermax experiment. If the guards couldn't survive Pelican Bay, what chance did the prisoners have? The walls began to crumble. By the late 2010s, lawsuits, protests, and relentless exposure forced California to slowly scale back Pelican Bay's worst practices. The SHU was downsized. Some prisoners were transferred. Reforms were promised. But even with change on paper, the scars remained. Inmates who had spent decades in isolation were released back into society, broken men who struggled to live in a world of freedom after years in a cage. Some committed suicide. Others reoffended, unable to cope with life outside. Pelican Bay had not just punished them. It had reshaped them forever. And for those who survived inside, one truth was clear. The prison never really let you go. The brutal truth. Today, Pelican Bay still stands, a gray fortress by the ocean, its towers watching over the fog. It's quieter now than in the 1990s, but the stories remain carved into its walls. Stories of men buried alive in solitary. Stories of riots that left bodies on the yard. Stories of lawsuits that exposed torture disguised as safety. For some, Pelican Bay was the answer to controlling the state's most dangerous criminals. But for others, it became a symbol of America's darkest prison experiment. And the brutal truth is this: Pelican Bay didn't just cage men. It broke them. It broke families. And it broke the very idea of justice. The echo behind the walls. The scream that started our story, echoing through the SHU, was not just one man's voice. It was the sound of an entire prison system, crying out from behind concrete and steel. Pelican Bay was built to control chaos. But in the end, it created chaos of its own. So the next time someone says prison is just a place for punishment, remember Pelican Bay. Remember the screams in the night. Remember the hunger strikes, the riots, the men driven to madness. Because once you step inside those walls, the truth is far more brutal than the world was ever meant to see.